Thank you very much. Well, it's a real treat to be here. I must say that I spoke at a West Side Rotarian luncheon about 30 years ago. And somewhat of what I'm going to say, some of what I said then, I'm going to repeat today because I wasn't very effective at seeing that my recommendations were implemented. So I'm hoping that the gray hair will help me out here. Let's see if I can. All right, so this has been a really wet summer, everybody knows. I've been here for over 40 years, and I can say this is the wettest summer I've ever had in Madison. And we've had flooding everywhere in the county. I'm going to focus on the Yahara lakes, but I want to emphasize that there are other parts of the county that were probably hit harder than the Yahara lakes. The graphic you see are the annual maximum levels on Lake Mendota and Lake Monona. And it's very obvious that there's an increasing trend on both of those lakes. You're probably wondering about the dip in Monona, and that just has to do with how the lakes were controlled back during that period. So early on, there was an effort to protect Monona, and Mendota was the reservoir, basically, and that stopped about 30 years ago. So why are the lake levels increasing? Well, obviously, extreme rainfalls have increased. That's been predicted by climate change models. It's very obvious. I'll show you a graphic in a second to support that. I'm going to emphasize today urbanization, and that's what I talked about 30 years ago. That's a big problem. Urbanization has increased the amount of water going to the lakes. There are also some constrictions in the channel below Lake Monona, and they're going to need some attention too. Those constrictions make it difficult to drain Lake Monona. And if you can't drain Lake Monona, you can't release water from Lake Mendota. So that's a big part of the problem. Okay, this is a plot from NOAA, and it just shows increases in the maximum daily rainfall amounts from the Midwest. And you can see that increasing pattern. I have a similar plot for the United States. You would get the same thing if you looked at Wisconsin. So there's no question that intense rainfalls are increasing. So how do we fix this problem? Well, I'm going to emphasize urbanization. We can't continue to urbanize and increase the amount of runoff to the lakes. That's kind of obvious, and I'm going to talk about how we can fix that problem. We're not going to stop urbanizing. We need places for people to live. We need growth. It keeps the community vital. Obviously, the constrictions in the channel are going to have to be dealt with. And there are going to be some, I think, a hard look at how we manage the lakes. But again, I'm going to emphasize urbanization. I think all of you are familiar with what urbanization does in terms of the hydrologic cycle. And the big issue, of course, are impervious surfaces. And I'm grateful for those impervious surfaces. Otherwise, we'd all be wet in this room because the roof is impervious. And of course, we don't want to go back to the cowboy days where you're walking around in muddy streets. So we need impervious surfaces, but we can mitigate that, and I'll get to that in a bit. There's another piece that we don't often think about. Most natural areas have depressions of all sizes, natural depressions, and those depressions actually greatly increase the amount of water that infiltrates. So we don't like depressions in our roof or on our street. We get a few potholes in the winter, but we try to fix those as quickly as we can. And of course, the velocity of the water increases because water runs off so much faster. Okay, urban development. This is a nice graphic that I got from John Reimer, who's with the county. And the main thing to look at are the colors, the red and blue. The 2017, the present is the both red and blue, and then the early development in 1970 is all blue. So you can see there's been about a doubling of urbanization in the watershed during that time from 1970. But the key thing is you can see the colors are only a small part of that Yahara Lakes watershed. So there's a lot more places where urbanization can occur and where we would increase the amount of water coming into the lakes. Now, a subject that's been near and dear to me for a long time are these so-called internally drained areas. How many of you have been to Goose Pond, for example? Okay. Goose Pond is an internally drained area. It's in an internally drained area. And what I mean is that any runoff to that pond stays in that pond, evaporates or seeps. It does not go into a stream. And there are many, many of these around the watershed, the Yahara watershed, and I'll show you a graphic in a bit. So internally drained areas are areas with depressions such that no water leaves those areas. It stays in those, and hence it doesn't get to the lakes. Now, in some cases, internally drained areas have been partially drained to increase agricultural productivity, and that's the case for Goose Pond, by the way. It's internally drained, but in that internally drained area, on land that's not part of the pond, there's some agriculture, and when the water gets high enough, some of that water actually goes into a storm sewer that was put in so the farmers could drain their fields. So a little bit of that has happened, but urbanization is the big culprit. Urbanization really causes a much bigger problem because obviously runoff from an agricultural area is much less than an urban area. And so the typical thing that happens when we urbanize, when we develop in a watershed of an internally drained area, is that first the low spot fills up with water. So what was once a wetland or a small pond becomes a big pond, and at some point expands in area. And when that happens, almost always we find some way to drain that. And when we drain it in this case into the lakes. Here's an example. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Acewood Pond. Anybody ever been there? It's on the east side of Madison. And there's a photo from 1937. That wasn't a pond in 1937. That was a wetland. There was probably hardly ever any water there. And on the right, it shows it in 2000, where it was just a pond 3 or 4 feet deep, which overflows into a channel, a storm channel, and then into the stream. So there's a case here. Starkweather Creek is that stream, and Starkweather Creek eventually goes into Lake Monona. So I think many of you probably are familiar with that. Esser Pond. Now this is a photo. It's distorted because this was taken from the air, from a drone, and so it's a little bit distorted. But you can see Esser Pond on the left. How many of you have seen Esser Pond? Okay, so you've seen that. When I came here, Esser Pond was dry almost all the time. It occasionally had water after a rain, and it completely dried up. Now it's permanently ponded, and it's expanded so much that it now overflows. When it gets high enough, it overflows into Pheasant Branch. So there's a case where we've taken sort of the classical case, Esser Pond. There's also Stricker Pond, Tiedemann Pond. People know those ponds. When Stricker overflows into Tiedemann, and when Tiedemann gets high, we have pumps. This summer, we added another pump to keep from flooding the people that live there. So you have no choice. Once you do this, you're pretty much going to either pump it or drain it, or you're going to flood people that live next to it. So you end up having to flood. So you need to plan better from the beginning. Okay, so how much land do we have? How many closed areas, internally drained areas, do we have in the watershed? This is an earlier attempt to determine that. We're still figuring it out because it's complicated. Because you not only have to find them all, but you have to see where they might drain. And so you have to go out and inspect every one of them, and there are thousands of them. So this shows roughly what the areas are in the Mendota-Monona watershed, and that's about 16% of that watershed is internally drained. Now the county is doing a much more precise delineation, and this is an early product. They still have work to do, and the gray areas they haven't finished. But everything else has been finished. And there are two colors in there. They're black areas. They're the areas that drain to these depressions. And then the depressions themselves are in red. So if you look at the black and the red, that's the total area that's in internally drained areas. So that's a lot of space. That's a lot of land. And most of that's not drained. Okay, only a small percentage of it has been developed. Okay, this is a graph just to show that it makes a difference. And so I don't expect you to completely understand how I put this together, but Basically, what I show here is the ratio of the annual flow from two creeks. One is Pheasant Branch, which is on the west side, part of Madison, North Fork in Middleton, and then flows down into Lake Mendota eventually. And I'm just showing what we call stormflow. It's just a part of the flow that came off during events as opposed to what comes out of the ground slowly as springs. So it's just the quick flow, the flow that gets there quickly. And I'm looking at the ratio, and you can see there's a jump in that ratio. Pheasant Branch started having a lot more water in 1990 or so, and that coincides with when Madison developed a large closed depression in the South Fork watershed, and then drained it, daylighted it to the stream. And so the combination of the impervious area and the additional area that never drained caused that big bump in flow. So it really can make a big difference. Okay, so what can we do about it? We're not going to stop developing, but we can control the amount of volume, the volume of water that comes off of development. And you can see some of the practices we use. That's a bioretention area in a parking lot. There are a lot of permeable hard surfaces. You can see one there. There's also permeable asphalt and permeable pavement, and they work very, very well. They're very successful, so we can do that. What about control? Obviously, you have to have some kind of legislation to control this, and volume control was established in Dane County in 2004. Middleton, by the way, had done it before. They were partly because because I was involved, sort of screwed up on Stricker and Tiedemann Pond, so we realized that we needed to not cause that problem in other areas. And so the county had an ordinance in 2004. It was built on Wisconsin DNR regulations from 2002, which was a pass-on from the federal government in the Clean Water Act in 1998 or so. So this all came down, but it was all for water quality purposes, So the DNR ordinance has nothing to do with flooding. It just came out of the fact that if you increase the amount of water, you cause channel erosion. And Pheasant Branch and the Conservancy right now, there's some massive channel erosion. Okay, so what's wrong with that ordinance? Why is it not sufficient? It's because it's only 90% control. That's the problem. And so I'm going to introduce a term we use here, and it's an easy one to follow. Stay on is the difference between precipitation and runoff. So you have precipitation, and then some of it stays on, it infiltrates, and then the rest runs off. So the limitation is on stay on, and the requirement is that 90% of the original stay on has to stay on. Now you might say that's pretty good. It's only 10% off, but that 10% is huge. And here's the evidence. We used 1981 to design practices. In 1981, we don't look at the winter, just the non-cold season. There's 29 inches in that year. The pre-development runoff was only 2 inches, and that's all based on modeling. So the stay on is the difference. 29 minus 2, 27. Take 90% of that, that's what you're controlling. What you're not controlling is 4.7 inches. That's twice the pre-development. So that last 10% doubles, not going from 90 to 100 means you're doubling the amount of water running off. That's still a big number. Okay, there's some other, I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to go through that. One other limitation of the Dane County ordinance is that they don't have any special rules for internally drained areas. Middleton did have some other communities have had some, but the county doesn't. Now, I had the pleasure of chairing a technical committee of the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission and the Lakes and Watershed Commission to look at improving the county ordinance, and we finished that up last year. And it was a great committee. We had 9 consulting engineers who all work for developers. So we were getting a good connection to the development community. We had 3 municipal engineers, county staff, and the University of Wisconsin. We recommended 100% control and some other things that I don't want to go into too much detail. We also had special requirements for internally drained areas. Since we wanted to control them to 100%, we had to make sure they didn't have internal flooding. So we had some requirements there. But we recognize that this could be expensive and it's not easy to do on every project. And so we just used a common strategy that environmentalists have been using for many years, and that's trading. And we did this through a fee in lieu of. That is, if you're on a site where it's not very efficient to do volume control for a variety of reasons, you can pay a fee that can be used to do it somewhere else. And that has a long tradition. We have pollution trading that we've been doing in this country for 50 years. Air pollution was super effective, dealing with sulfur and nitrogen. So if a power plant's too old, they can't upgrade, they can pay a fee and a new power plant can do a better job. So you keep track of how much is going in the atmosphere, and the people who can do it efficiently get paid by the people who can't. We did the same thing with biological oxygen demand on the Wisconsin and Fox rivers from all the paper mills. Paper mills that were old and they couldn't control their wastes were picked up basically by the newer ones, but they had to pay a fee. It's a very sophisticated method they use. It's really quite interesting. We're doing it right now with phosphorus. I think most of you are familiar with that. Clean Lakes Alliance. So we're doing the same thing there. Some places, some ways you can be much more effective in dealing with phosphorus. And the beauty of what I'm talking about with volume control is if you control volume, you control phosphorus. So it's a nice synergy there with an ongoing program that's working really well. Okay, and I'm going to skip this. It's clear how you might, well, we don't know the details of how we're going to do it, but the county would manage it. There'll be projects the county will do, and they will bank volumes, and then they'll be reimbursed in cases where you can't get full control. Now, there's one roadblock. At the end of the last legislative session, the legislature passed an ordinance prohibiting local governments from acquiring more than 90% control. Now, this might sound reasonable because, well, okay, why do we want to be more stringent than the state? Well, the DNR requirement was a water quality requirement. It wasn't a flooding requirement. So you're basically saying you can't do what's necessary to prevent flooding because the state doesn't do it. Well, the state has no ordinance for flooding. So that's false. And so that's got to be fixed. So what's the next steps? There's a technical committee being formed right now. And it's going to make recommendations as to, and hopefully on some volume control, but on how to manage the lakes and so on. And I just want to give a shout out to a computer program that they're going to use, something called Yahara. Okay, I didn't make the slide. I got it from a student. They're much better than I am at making slides. But I got to learn how to use them, right? I didn't realize that would take 3 clicks. So anyway, this model, Yahara, you can go on the website, find it, just go put in Yahara, and you can get it. It's a model that was put together by Professor Chin Wu, a colleague of mine, and John Reamer was his student, and he's now the one managing that model. And it's a computer model that takes observations, USGS gauges, buoys that they put out that give elevation, and meteorologic data and so on and so forth. And then it has models that can actually estimate how much runoff you're going to get from given rainfall. So you can pick historic years, and you can use the rainfall from those years and determine how much runoff there would have been. And then the model does all the hydraulics as to where the water is going to go and how high the levels are going to get. So you're able, any ideas we come up with can be tested, and we can see how well they work. So that's really great. Whoops, there's more. Wow. Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. One thing that I don't see much discussion about it is billions and billions of roads and parking lots that they are helping to reduce the stay-ons. And by using different type of a construction material, we can make them in a way that the parking lots pass the, is there anything going on in that area? Because
yes.
those things not only warm up the atmosphere and increase the temperature of Earth, but also stay-ons and weird weathers.
Yeah. UW parking lot down by Helen Waters. There's a parking lot right in the lake. My student had done some work on that, and the city put in permeable asphalt there. So, and Middleton is using a lot of permeable asphalt. There's also permeable concrete that works very well. And then there are other strategies. So you're correct, yes. And we need to do that more.
Ken, what do the models that you use show would happen to the Madison lakes if we had an extreme rain event?
Well, I did some work on the 2008 event that hit Lake Delton, and I basically took all the rainfall data and moved it to the Yahara lakes to see what would have happened. So we modeled it, and it would have been a real catastrophe. It's hard to say exactly what would have happened because it would have depended on how they managed it. But the flows going down the Yahara River, if they could have let it out, would have been like 10 times what we've ever seen. So it would have been very bad. We were fortunate this year, actually. We had a lot of storms. I was watching it that went north or went south. It could have been much, much worse. The big storm back on the 20th, August 20th, really didn't hit the lakes very much. It killed Middleton and Black Earth Creek, but it really didn't quite make it to the lakes. So, yes. Well, that's a question we're going to have to look at. That sounds like something that would be beneficial, but it turns out that they tried all winter to get the lakes down. The problem is they can't just let it down and then flood the lower lakes. So that's one part of it. It's really hard to get Mendota down. And second, there's not that much water involved in the sense that an early storm could fill that up, and then you're having a hard time getting it out. So we're going to look at it. It might have some benefit. I'm expecting we will try to set lower levels, but that's not by itself going to solve the problem.
I have some lakefront property in Sauk County, but Sauk County follows DNR rules, and I found it very, very frustrating that our property has a very steep slope, natural slope to the lake, and I wanted to terrace the land to reduce runoff. And of course, where I am on Lake Wisconsin, I don't have a flooding issue because we're right above the dam, but there's flooding below the dam. And the state is very opposed to changing the natural terrain to allow terracing, which is thousands of years old. I mean, people figured this out a long time ago.
Yes, I think we always have these conflicts, and we need to understand what's most important and be willing to compromise. So that's all I can say on that.
Ken, over here.
Sorry.
My understanding is the state legislature recently passed rules that allow the filling of those non-contributory wetlands because
Yes.
they're not connected to.
Yes, and that
Is that a good idea?
that's a very bad idea. And thank you for bringing that up.
Hi, thank you for coming. I live near Sauk Creek, and there's a city plan to totally do Sauk Creek on the west side to increase water flow. And one of their plans is to cut down 5,000 trees. Are trees a problem?
Well, trees are generally very good and reduce flooding most of the time. But there are situations, for example, in the Pheasant Branch Conservancy, that's a big sandbox, and trees don't do very well because they fall over because of the sand. So hundreds of trees fell over in the Pheasant Branch Conservancy, and when the tree falls over, then they're a real problem in high floods. So people have to understand the application. But in general, trees are things we want to keep, but occasionally they can be problematic.
Can you comment on what can be done to increase the flow in the lower lakes and what the problem is?
Yeah, I haven't tracked that in great detail, but there are 3 bridges involved, and then there's a Native American weir. And one thing is you have to address all of them. because you understand if you have three impediments, getting rid of one doesn't matter, right? It's, you know, if you're in a traffic jam, it doesn't matter if you add to the traffic jam, you're just not going to move. So whatever's left is going to cause a problem. People have looked at this in the past. There's limited land to work with and property issues, but I think it's going to be looked at more seriously. And I think we really need to try to make some progress on that. Mary.
Ken, thanks very much for coming. And since you helped the Rouse family establish a rain garden in our front yard, which solved the mudslide problem on our street, I'd like you to comment about rain gardens and their effectiveness.
Yes, rain gardens can do a really good job of reducing the amount of runoff, and they can also prevent things like erosion. So it's really important that homeowners do that whenever they can. It makes for nice gardens, and so it obviously helps. And there's also a lot of symbolic importance to it, because as more and more people do it, more and more people become aware of the need to do things like that. So thank you for the rain garden.
I live on Brewery Creek in Cross Plains, and we had the brunt of the flooding earlier this year. And the stunning thing to me was the farmers, who normally have not been very strong global warming people, are starting to tell me that they don't even know how to farm anymore. Even when their fields are in crop, they're seeing just how much soil erosion is occurring with these rain events, and they literally don't know what to do. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, that's really interesting, because when the first settlers moved into the driftless area, in fact, I talked to one on Garfunkel Creek, who had letters from his grandfather in Germany to his father, basically, and the father was talking about how bad the erosion was in the driftless area, and the key is, in Europe they don't have these kinds of rainfalls, so these high intensity rainfalls are a real problem in the driftless area, and the thing that makes me most nervous about the driftless area and agriculture in general is that we made huge progress when the Soil Conservation Service was formed in the mid-30s. In the 50s and 60s, I actually did some research on one of the streams, and just much improvement in the reduction of peaks because of better practices. But, you know, corn ethanol reversed some of that, loss of conservation reserve program lands. I think we know how to farm, but we just got to get back to the right practices. And then there's some places you just can't farm very easily. So,
thank you, Ken. Can you give the group here 3 things that they can do today to help with flood mitigation and also phosphorus to lakes? And I can come up with a couple of them, but maybe you give the 3 low-hanging fruit, I guess, that things that we can do as a society now, because we've spent 150 years building out our farms and our homes and our parking lots to get the water as fast as we can to the lakes. So give us 3 things to take us to a better place.
well, one thing is to look at your property and see, is there a downspout I can change so that it goes more on grass and doesn't go right down the driveway. The previous house I lived in, I actually took a downspout, and then I put, which was coming towards the street, and in front of the house I put another section that I turned it 90 degrees, so it's right in a garden, and then I put holes in it. So most of that water was going into that garden and not going, even when I'd go to the garden and then it would have to go down the lawn. So rather than have that water go down at what was once a channel. So one thing is you can look at your property and do something. The second thing is you can tell your neighbor, talk to your neighbor and tell them how important it is, that every house matters and we need to do a better job. Third thing, maybe I combined two. I think you just have to look. There's so many things you can do on your property if you just think about it. You don't want to be getting water away. you really want to keep it on, it benefits your grass or whatever you have, your plants, so keep as much water as you can on your property.
Thank you, Ken, for your timely presentation. We should have probably had Jane pull up the weather radar to see if it's still raining outside. So with that, we are adjourned.